Good morning, everybody. Welcome to class this morning. Thank you all for watching. We're going to be getting into some Module 8 content material in just a little bit. Before we do that, I have a couple other things I want us to do this morning. One is to examine a few announcements, and in doing so, kind of take some inventory of where we're at in the semester. As I reminded you all of yesterday, your Module 7 assignments are due today by 11:59 p.m., so please make sure you're getting those turned in. You have until this evening to do that. I also dropped zeros in the gradebook for anything that was up to Module 7 that hasn't been turned in yet. So you might have seen a drastic drop in your grade over the weekend, and that was because of that. If you would like an opportunity to make up some of these assignments, please get in touch with me and let me know, and we can see what we can work out. Also, one of the things that I kind of want to do this morning is to just kind of take some inventory of where we're at in terms of the semester. The summer semester is over July 29th, which is 17 days from today, which is roughly 2.5 weeks. So we are quickly coming up to the end of the course. We have Module 8, Module 9, Module 10. We have plus the final exam. So we have 3 modules plus the final exam to do in our last 2.5 weeks. However, in general, these are some of our quicker modules, so they should be easier for us to kind of cram into these 2.5 weeks and still give you some time to actually take time on your final exam. So if you have any questions about any of that, please get in touch with me. Let me know. You kind of want to. You also probably want to kind of make a little bit of an assessment of where you're at, with the course being, roughly 2. So, what I'd like to do at the start today, before I get into some Module 8 material, is I'd like to take a trip back in time to Module 6. And I would like to look at the lab for Module 6. Because there were several people who I don't think really understood what was going on with the assignment. Several of you were not using the software to its fullest advantage. And that resulted in some heavy point removal here, because this is supposed to be how we use Excel and spreadsheets to our fullest advantage and how we can make these work for us. So essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that entire lab right now for you, just so you can see things in action. So let me switch to full screen here. And what I've already done here is I've already kind of created the sheet and put the data in it, just to save us a little bit of time here. But that actually is going to be the thing that's going to take me the longest out of all of this. As you can see here, as I zoom in, essentially what I've done is I've gone to some websites for 4 universities: the University of North Carolina, NC State University, Duke University, and UNCG. And I have here their tuition and fees for 1 year, their housing and meals for 1 year, their books and personal expenses for 1 year. Duke was the only one to kind of have that line item listed out, so the rest of those in the books and personal expenses is just kind of estimated. And then we have spaces for our total 1 year and our total 4 years. Now, even if we look at something like our regular cells here, for example, University of North Carolina here, when I went to their website to look at their tuition and fees, their tuition was on one line, their fees were on another line, so they had those separated. And what they had listed was only for 1 semester and not the calendar year. So even here, I took advantage of Excel. And so if I click and select this cell, you can see my math equation here in our bar, right? So what I did was I took the cost per hour, which cost per credit hour was $292.46, multiplied that by a 12-hour credit load for a semester, and then multiplied that by 2 to make it good for the whole year. So that's 12, that's a full load 12 credit hour semester times 2, plus the fees times 2 for both semesters. And so we can see that here for UNC. We can see something similar here for NC State. Duke's had theirs listed out directly, as did UNCG. And so even here, like, I'm not pulling out a separate calculator. I'm not doing any tabulations on paper. I'm letting Excel do my math for me because that's the software that I'm in. I don't want to change to any other piece of software, do anything different or anything like that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just make my totals for 1 year. So I know that B2, C2, and D2 are all of the ones that are going to be my total expenses for 1 year at the University of North Carolina. So I can put my calculations in here. Equals. I can use my sum function. And we can use our cell references from C2. Or actually, it starts with B2, doesn't it? We'll use our from B2 colon to be like 2. B2 to D2. So that's D2. And so notice here that I've used all relative cell references. There's nothing in there to make these cell references absolute. To make these absolute cell references, I would put the $sign before the B or the $sign before the D. If I made these absolute based on the column, it wouldn't change anything. So we could do that here and put $signs before the B and $signs before the D. And now what I can do is, since all of those are relative, I can take this current calculation, I can take this fill handle square down in the corner, just drag it down, and I can see the calculations for the rest of the schools automatically. Same thing here with 4 years. I can say E. So I can just write an equation here that'll take the value that's in E2, multiply it by 4, equals E2 times 4. As simple as that. Fill that down. Gives me my values for all of that. So just like that, right, we have those calculations made. Now one of the things that we might want to do here, just to make things look a little nicer, is take all these cells that we have our number data in here and highlight them and format them for currency. So right click, format, currency, 2 decimal places. That makes them look like money since we're dealing with money. And so the next thing that your assignment asks you to do was make a graph. So I would highlight the section that I want to make in the graph, which is the total for years. I can insert a pie chart, 2D pie chart, which we have our total for years here. Now it's not using all of our labels yet, so we need to fix that. We'll click this funnel here. We'll select names, our categories here. We'll select data for those, and we'll use our school comparison for the data, and click OK. Whoops. We were in the wrong thing there. Names, categories, select data for our categories. We want to edit here and select those there. And now we can see we have our labels down here across the bottom: UNC, NC State, Duke, and UNCG. And we can hit OK for that. We can add chart elements here. We can add data labels to put the dollar values onto the chart. So there we have a nice full chart here. And let me just show you that again where we added those names just to make sure it's clear. I clicked on names here. I clicked on categories. I clicked select data. I made sure I was over here. That's what I forgot the first time, is I didn't click this edit button here, and that allowed me to select our titles for them there. So now we have a nice full chart here that represents our data completely. And if we changed anything over here, like if all of a sudden Duke got a lot cheaper, that's going to update our graph automatically here. So that's why we do this, right? Like everything is done automatically. The 1 year is done automatically. The 4 years are done automatically. So if changes happen, if things change, we can just go in here and manipulate our data and everything's good. So that means the only thing left to do is to take the averages. So I've already made my averages tab down here for that. And I have my column headings here: average tuition and fees, average housing and meals, average books, personal expenses, average total 1 year, average total 4 years. This is easy, right? So we know that our tuition and fees is our B column, B2 to B5. And so let's zoom in here. As we're referencing our other column, we will just put an exclamation point after the sheet name. So we can say equals and use our average function. Our sheet name, which is school comparison, exclamation point B2 to school comparison. What was it? B5, I believe. And there it is. So that's the average of all of those in our school comparison column. And we can use this fill handle and fill right. And that'll fill out the rest of our chart. Just like that. Right click that, format the cells, make them currency. Save that and submit it, and you're done. And so now you can make changes in your school comparison chart, and it'll also change everything in your averages at the same time as well, automatically. So that's why we make sure that we use these formulas, and that's why we make sure we use these relative cell references, because it makes our lives easier. Right, so all we would have to do here is save this and submit it. At this point, everything is what we would want. So with that now, if you have any more questions about that, please contact me. With that now, we are going to swap over to our Module 8 material. And our Module 8 material is something that's pretty important to me, something that I think is pretty important. And that is information literacy. Now more than ever, we see information literacy being of critical importance. And so when we were redesigning this class for this summer semester, one of the things that we looked at was, well, how can we start to explain the idea of information literacy just because it is so important for people? You know, being able to see data online and evaluate it to see, well, is this data real or is this data not? Because we see a real prevalence of misinformation and disinformation online nowadays. So let's start out with the question of why we cover this. And I think the reason of why we cover this material was really clearly espoused by this 2016 Stanford University study. Stanford University studied middle, high school, and college-age students across 12 different states. So there were a total of 7,804 students included in this study. And this study indicated that students have trouble judging the credibility of online news, of Facebook and Twitter, social media posts, photographs, videos, blog posts, other digital messages. And they really struggled to distinguish fake ads from articles and neutral sources from biased ones and fake accounts from real accounts. And the root cause of all this was that these individuals lacked verification skill. They lacked digital literacy, digital information literacy. So it was recommended by this study that that digital information literacy or digital news literacy is added to curriculum to kind of address these critical thinking skills that you need for approaching these topics. And you know, I think this is a good place to teach it in this course. And really, we can look at information literacy pretty much the exact same way that we look at regular literacy. Because really, literacy has changed over time, right? Like prior to the late 90s, 2000s. So really, you know, from the invention of the internet, 1994 forward, we started to get this evolution of literacy from what it was in the early 20th century, which was just reading and writing, into this 21st century literacy, which was reading and writing with new digital formats and technologies. Now, you know, prior to the internet, it was relatively easy to determine what was real and what wasn't, right? Like we could look at, I mean, I think, you know, a lot of you aren't quite old enough to remember this sort of thing, but, you know, I think if you go back to the mid-90s, early 90s, and, you know, look at the end of a grocery store register counter, and you see all the tabloids, which a lot of them, some of them are still there, but there definitely aren't as many as there were there back then. You know, it was easy to see that these tabloids were more sensationalistic, more fake than, say, the newspapers and the newspaper boxes that were also available. You know, it was a bit easier to tell, but once we get into the digital era where publication formats change, right? Like everybody's tweets look the same. Everybody's Facebook posts look the same, essentially. You can make a website look like any other website. And so with that, it starts to blur the lines of what's real and what's fake. So in this information literacy idea, we're adding critical thinking plus a willingness to view the process of learning information in new and different ways. And so we can kind of take all of this and boil it down into a singular definition for information literacy, which is to be information literate, a person must be able to recognize when information is needed and have the ability to locate, evaluate, and use effectively the information needed. And this actually isn't a new idea in terms of information literacy. This is an old idea. This came from the Presidential Commission on Information Literacy, which was formed back in 1989. But we can take these ideas here that are in this quote and kind of apply them to what we're doing today. And I think some big things to pull out here is to, one, recognize when information is needed. That's kind of heavy when you think about it. When is information needed? Do I need this information? Do I personally need this information? And we can kind of flip that and say, well, this person who shared this information, why did they need to share this information? So do I personally need this information? Did that person who's sharing this information, what are they gaining out of sharing this information? And then we're tasked to find, evaluate, and use information needed. So we determine what information that we need versus what information other people want to share with us or feel like they need to share with us. And then we use our skills to find the information we need, evaluate the veracity, relevancy, truthfulness of the information we think we need, and take the information we need and put it into action. Use that information that we need and do so effectively. Now, there's some interesting things that we know about literacy that we can apply to some of our digital stuff that we'll be talking about in just a little bit. One is that reading is difficult for some people. Reading is difficult for some. So when we think about literacy, we first must think about reading being difficult for certain people. Some people can get necessary information out of a document. Some people cannot. Some people can evaluate certain things in a document, like tone, which is kind of important certain times, especially like when somebody's joking. And some people have a tough time with that. Right? So this makes reading difficult. And when we say difficult here, we're not just talking about like reading the words. We're talking about reading the words and deriving meaning from those words. And so, for example, like one of the things that is the most common is people have trouble telling when someone else is joking via text, because, you know, most of the time when somebody's joking, we use interpersonal clues. We use tone of voice, and we use facial expressions, and we use, laughter from the person telling us this information to kind of indicate to us that something is supposed to be a joke. But in text online, it's harder for us to tell when something's supposed to be a joke and when something isn't. And some people are more, have a higher degree of ability to tell when that's happening, and others have more trouble with it. And that's because reading itself is an unnatural act. We don't come out of the womb knowing how to read. Right? We're not born with this knowledge of reading. We have to learn how to read. And especially reading English is incredibly difficult because of all of the idioms and turn of phrases and all these different things that are unique to the English language that aren't in other languages, which is why you'll also often find people who are English as a second language speakers who originally learned a different language and then learned English. They'll have trouble reading certain things and getting information out of them because of the fact that English is terrible. It's rife with idioms. It's rife with these phrases that don't really mean what they, specifically what they say. And so it makes the comprehension of what you're reading more difficult. Reading also induces a psychological spiral either up or down, which is incredibly important when we're looking at information literacy and how we evaluate things online. Because people understand this. People understand that reading something can cause you to spiral up or spiral down. It can cause you to experience emotions. Which is why when we look at a lot of misinformation and disinformation, the design of that information is to elicit an emotion out of you. It's to make you angry or to make you sad, to get you kind of riled up. Because as we read, we encounter this psychological spiral. So with that, comprehension is key. Being able to understand what you're reading and put it into context with its veracity, with its truthfulness, becomes incredibly important. And this doesn't come with age or with maturity or with, any of this other stuff. It comes with practice. And we take this modern literacy and we expand this on the internet. So to take one of those sentences there and kind of frame it out, this idea that it is a myth about literacy, that it improves with age or that it improves with maturity. It doesn't. Right? And we can see that now. Right, like there are a ton of older people online sharing misinformation and disinformation because they lack the information literacy skills to be able to determine what is real and what is fake. And I have some theories behind a lot of what we'll be talking about today that we'll go into a little bit on, and this is one of them. And I think a lot of this, we can put that into a frame of reference with the last slide that says that, improvement in literacy of any kind, of reading or, of traditional literacy or of information literacy, digital literacy, it doesn't improve with age. It doesn't improve with maturity. It improves with practice. So in that sort of way, we can put everybody who is getting on the internet at the same time, regardless of what age they are, on the same level playing field. And we might think, well, like, you're older, you're going to be smarter about things. But that's not necessarily true. Because you've not encountered the tricks. You've not encountered misinformation online. You've not encountered disinformation online. You've not encountered the tactics that people use in putting misinformation and disinformation online. You don't know the skills to evaluate disinformation. These are things that you're missing. So everybody who is older here is all kind of on the same level, because as people who are not quite as old that are getting on the internet for the first time because they don't have the practice at determining what is real and what is fake. And we see this with kind of the way that people have migrated to the internet. Early adoption of the internet, late 90s to like around 2004, 2005, even up until like 2008. It was all a certain segment of the population that was on the internet. Especially like in the late 90s, we saw, it was primarily universities, research based. A certain persona, a certain segment of the population was on the internet. And they experienced the things that were on the internet. The internet wasn't really accessible yet for everybody. Right? But as we moved into the 2000s, internet not only became more accessible for everyone, more widely available, but it almost became a requirement. Right? Like nowadays we have to get online and fill out forms or get online to do this or do that. It's a requirement. So we have to get online to be able to do some of the things that we need to do. So if we would have done that a different way prior to 2010, then that would be something wholly different. Than what we had experienced from 2010 forward. It's also a myth that slow readers lack intelligence, and this is really one of those things that kind of transcends literacies, from regular reading, traditional literacy, to modern digital information literacy. Taking your time with something does not show a lack of intelligence. In fact, it could show quite the opposite. The fact that I'm going to be more critical about what I'm reading, that I'm going to take my time with it, that I'm going to think about it as I'm reading it, instead of just ingesting it quickly and coming up with a conclusion from that. And a lot of this breaks down to how we get news today. And I've got this graphic on the next slide here that kind of examines that pretty well. Ever since kind of the Web 2.0, the social media takeover of the internet, we have these sort of fast lanes for information to get from wherever to you. Right? And these are our big social media sites. These are things like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. And this is also a good means that somebody can use to kind of camouflage the fact that they're putting out fake news, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But we can see here on the left side of the screen, here on the left side of this graphic, we have a lot of logos for news sources. Some of these are real, highly credible news sources, and other ones are not so much. Right? With some of them being completely phony, providing nothing but misinformation and disinformation. And so if we were to go to those sites directly, it might be easy for us to tell, well, this place is fake. Right? Like we can pick out some telltale signs, maybe see a pattern of behavior. Like we could start to use some critical thinking skills and determine what's real and what's fake. But that's not how information reaches everybody typically. Information reaches everybody via these social media pathways. Your LinkedIn article on Twitter. You're shown a video on YouTube. You're linked to articles and shown videos on Facebook. Right? And this is where the line starts to blur. Because there are a lot of people that don't know the difference between these news sites and Facebook. And you can kind of think of Facebook as credible, as a verifiable news source. Facebook doesn't provide us any news. right? All of the news on Facebook is from other sources. Some credible, some not. And that's where a lot of people get into trouble with sharing disinformation and creating misinformation. We retweet a tweet without thinking about it. We share a YouTube video or like something on Facebook, and all of a sudden we've perpetuated what is in essence some fake news because we didn't do our diligence to figure out whether the source of that news was credible or not. We just said, well, it's Facebook, so, it's good. It's Twitter, so it's okay. This person, I follow this person on Twitter and I trust them, so they would never tell me something wrong. YouTube recommended me this video, so obviously it's probably good, right? Well, we've got to take all of that really with a grain of salt and do our due diligence to verify it, because we've seen and we've known about and we've been inundated with, especially the past 4 to 6 years, of this idea of fake news. Fake news. We've heard a lot in the last several years about fake news and alternative facts. What's real and what's fake. And the idea of fake news isn't something that's new. Fake news has been going on for decades and even decades before. Essentially since the beginning of time, people want to try to use information to manipulate people. And really one of the earliest recorded instances of fake news in human history goes all the way back to the initial writing of human history. Herodotus, who is known as the father of modern history, he's the first person in the world to decide, we should write history down so we can remember it. And he would travel around from village to city and city to village and just finding whoever he could to record history of that area. And it became a game after a while to try to spin the most wild tale possible to try to get Herodotus to believe you. And write it down as history. Which really is quite incredible when you think about it, how as human beings, like this kind of human nature, one of our first instincts as individuals, when somebody decides, I'm going to try to do something good and I'm going to try to record what is essentially the news by writing down the history of these cities at this time period. The first inclination for somebody is, well, I'm going to lie to him and see if he believes it. And that kind of starts to get at why people do this today. Right? Sometimes it's just... Well, sometimes when people are delivering fake news, when people are lying, it's to meet an end. Right? There's a purpose behind it. They get something out of it. It helps their political candidate or negatively impacts the other political candidate or helps their business make more money or hurts their competitors or what have you. There's some kind of purpose to it. But then at the same time, for some people, it's kind of like the people who were talking to Herodotus. It's just for fun. It's just to see who I can get to believe some garbage. Like there are whole Reddits dedicated to people who have bought fake news or people who have thought satire websites were real. I have an example of one in just a little bit. There are a lot of cases where people think that stuff is real when it isn't, that was just started just for giggles, right? Just to be kind of funny. And nowadays with the term fake news, it's become ubiquitous. But there's no real one clear definition of what fake news means. Because sometimes fake news means what it is, news that is fake. Lies passed off as news, and sometimes fake news has just become kind of the catch-all term that we levy at something that we don't want people to believe. Something that's true that would impact us negatively, so we could just dismiss it as fake news. So that's why it becomes even more important that we as individuals are kind of cognizant of what we're doing and assessing our situations and looking at the information that we're presented critically. So that we can determine whether or not it's real. And there are several things that qualify as fake news. And let's look at some of those. First thing we have here is hoax news. And this is news that is completely fabricated with the intention of misleading or confusing readers. Remember, we talked about how reading causes you to go into a kind of a psychological spin. It can spin you up, it can spin you down. Right? So I can craft, if I'm a fake news provider, if I'm someone who's written hoax news, I can write a story in such a way that's going to make you mad. It's going to get you fired up. It's going to make you hate whoever I'm writing this story about. Because that's what happens. As we read things, we kind of get this spin up in our heads. We get this stuff going. And so I could write a story that's completely fake, that never once happened, or maybe some little tiny fact is true, but the rest of it was just completely made up. With the intention of that story putting you on tilt and making you so mad or so confused about what's going on that you don't know what to believe anymore, or you're ready to take up a pitchfork and storm the castle. That's how this stuff works. Right under hoax news, we have misleading news. Misleading news stories, report quote, misleading news story report quotes, images and or statistics that are out of context. So what I could do is I could create a study, right? And I could say 100% of dentists hate it when you brush your teeth. And that can be the headline that I can put out there, and that can be the news that I put out there, that 100% of dentists hate it when you brush your teeth. And you reading this, you kind of get that spin up again, that idea of, well, why do dentists hate it when you brush your teeth? What's going on here? Have we been lied to our whole lives about the goodness of brushing our teeth and how we should brush our teeth? But then once you dive into my study a little bit, you find that 100% of dentists were just the one dentist I talked to in the story, and I paid that dentist $500 to just say, brushing your teeth doesn't work. But then I could take that data and misrepresent it to you and say 100% of dentists say brushing your teeth doesn't work, or they hate it when you brush your teeth. It's not true. it's relatively true based on the information from the study, although the study itself was completely biased and rigged. We also see a lot of clickbait falling in this category, and we'll talk more about clickbait in just a little bit. Another thing is satire. And satire is supposed to be fake, right? Like, satire stories are stories that are fake and ironic, and they're intended to be funny or entertaining, but a lot of times, remember, reading is difficult for some people, and people mistake satire stories for real news. And I have a screenshot here on the right side. And this is something that's relatively recent, but also notice here, like, where it's at. Like, that's definitely a Facebook screenshot. That's a screenshot of Facebook. We're not on the Onion. Here we're on Facebook. So remember back to that, right? When people share news articles through these other social media means, it does kind of blur those lines a little bit, make things a little bit more difficult to verify, which means you have to do more work. But we have an Onion article here, and if you don't know the Onion by default is a satire website. They write articles that are jokes that are intended to be ironic or funny or entertaining. They're not news, and they don't claim to be news. But they have this article here: The Office actors launch podcast, urging fans to try watching something new. Which is a pretty, that's a pretty funny headline. Probably a pretty funny article behind that. But then in the comments here, we have somebody taking it seriously. Somebody acting like it's real. I doubt they mean it. They just don't want to be typecasted. Also, the people buying the DVDs already bought them. No more money to be made. It shows a lack of information literacy. And it also shows how Facebook and other social media sites can kind of obscure these articles. Another thing that happens a lot are mimic websites. And this is also something that fools a lot of people on, these social sites. You click a link and it looks like ABC News, but it's not really ABC News. It's abcnews.com.co. or ABE News. And then when you go to the website, it has the ABC News logo. Right, and this is really dangerous, because these people are trying to mimic legitimate news organizations, and that's going to do multiple things. One, that's going to ruin the reputation of the legitimate news organization. And two, that's going to make people more likely to believe something that's fake. Because at first glance, you believe it. It looks legit. So we want to make sure that we're looking at the right thing, that we're on the real website, that we're not on somewhere else that's trying to convince us that it's something that it's not. Clickbait. That's another one. We have some BuzzFeed articles here, really some fake BuzzFeed articles. And, some people will tell you that clickbait's fake news. I don't necessarily think that clickbait itself is fake news. I think it's just hyperbole. It's promoted with dramatic headlines or headlines that are slightly misleading. Like, man went to McDonald's and bought a hamburger. You'll never believe what he did next. That headline is trying to convince you to read it. Right? And then when you read the art, when you click and you read the article, you find out, he ate it. So technically, it happened. I don't know if it was that actually difficult to believe. But it did, and I actually think a rise of clickbait headlines actually comes from a rise in ad blockers, believe it or not. I have this theory that ad block use and clickbait increases is proportional. I don't have the data to back this up yet. I need to try to verify it. But essentially, when ad block use was low, news outlets could make more money on regular clicks. But as ad block usage went up, you needed more clicks for higher revenue because most of the people were blocking the ads. So you had to get more and more clicks to try to get the same amount of people who weren't blocking ads so you could make money off of that article, and thus clickbait. But we have some tips here as to how to spot fake news. One is to consider the source. Are other sites reporting this? Is it just this one site? Are other relevant news sources reporting this? Or is it just these one or two sites? Search information about this news site itself to figure out whether it's legitimate or whether it's fake. If you see something and it's also being reported by like other major newspapers, might be real. So you want to consider the source. Who is telling you this information? You want to read beyond the headline. Now, I know that requires us to read. But as we just saw, headlines can be outrageous, right? Like headlines can be clickbait. They can be designed to try to get us riled up or excited to read an article. So we want to read beyond that headline and read the story to try to figure out some more information. Who's the author? Are they real? Is that a real author, or is that just somebody made up to put a byline on an article? Can you Google them and figure out any more information on them to kind of learn their personal biases or what they do? That's something to consider. Again, supporting sources. Is anybody else reporting this? Or anybody else credible? Check the date. That's one of the things you'll see a lot is like, we're reporting things from 15 years ago and trying to make it seem new. That's something. Is it a joke? It could just be something like The Onion, where it's satire. You want to research the site and find out. Another thing here is you want to check your own biases. One of the things common nowadays is that we kind of put ourselves in an echo chamber because online we have this ability to only get information that we want to hear because we follow the people that we want to follow. We read the things that we want to read. We subscribe to the list that we want to subscribe to. So when we do that, we kind of isolate ourselves in this information silo. So could our own biases impact what we're reading and what we're listening to and what we're watching? So you want to consider if your own beliefs could impact your judgment on a certain thing. And there's always experts that you can ask. Talk to librarians. Talk to a librarian here at the college. They'd be willing to help you with some information literacy stuff. There are fact-checking sites, which we'll look at in just a minute, that you could look at. That also helps out a lot. In our module, we talk about our crap. We want to know our crap. And that's currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. Current, whether it's recent and has information about the latest advances and ideas. Relevance is the source is related to your topic and helps to support your argument. Authority is that if the author is known and an expert. Also, if the publisher is known and an expert. Accuracy, facts are correct and backed up with citations. So they're not just saying things, they have things to back up what they're saying. And the purpose of what you're reading. The source is intended to provide info and present multiple views of an argument, or makes a strong case for one side supported by citations. These are all key. We can look at this in another way by utilizing our 5 key questions. These are things that we want to ask as we read something. And really, it's the same type of stuff from knowing our crap, but it's just phrased in a different way. Like, who created this message? Are they real? Are they an expert? What creative techniques are used to attract my attention? Is there clickbait here? Are there graphics here that are designed to be manipulative? Are they writing to kind of get me fired up and using those psychological spins? What's going on? How might different people understand this message differently? Because different people experience the same media message differently. Remember, things like reading is hard for some people. So they're going to experience that media message differently. Some people have these biases that are more in tuned to a certain media message. So they're going to experience it differently. All of these things are going to result in different experiences for information. What values, lifestyles, and point of views are represented in or omitted from this message? Think about that one. That can be pretty heavy when you're thinking about certain bits of information. And one of the big things here is why is this message being sent? Who stands to gain something? Does anybody stand to gain something? What could be the purpose behind this? And so finally, I have those websites here that I mentioned previously that you could use to help you get some fact-checking assistance. Things like factcheck.org, which is a project of the Annenberg Public Policy Center of the University of Pennsylvania. They're nonpartisan, they're nonprofit, which means that no bias directly funds them or directly funds their whole thing. They're nonpartisan, and they're not trying to make money. They just want to make sure that they reduce the level of deception and confusion in politics, specifically. And that's a line from their website directly. Snopes.com is one of the oldest internet rumor and fact-checking websites. It handles all different types of rumors and fact-check situations. Most of it that you see is just political because that's kind of what has the largest impact, and that's what we see the most of. But there are other situations where it's different. Maybe it's about video games, or maybe it's about food, or maybe it's about something else weird. The owner there says they're apolitical. And I tend, it seems legitimate as you see some of their reviewing and fact-checking. There doesn't seem to be any bias. Sometimes things swing for one side, sometimes things swing for the other based on the situation. And PolitiFact is a fact-checking website that rates the accuracy of claims made by elected officials and others who speak up in American politics. Again, politics, the biggest thing is it has the biggest impact, so you see that a lot. PolitiFact's run by editors and reporters for the Tampa Bay Times, a legitimate news source on its own, so you might think that it wants to further its credibility by doing fact-checking properly. And so that's where we'll end here. We'll stop there. And we've reached our hour mark anyway, so I think we're good for a live stream for today. So remember that your Module 7 assignments are due tomorrow. Or your Module 7 assignments are due tonight. I got ahead of myself here because I was going to say Module 8 starts tomorrow. So again, your Module 7 assignments are due tonight by 11:59 p.m. Module 8 begins tomorrow. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'll hang out in chat for just a couple minutes with the music playing, just in case anybody who's with me live has any questions. But as always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.